It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Jake Berry, the SNP's leader at Westminster, Ian Blackford, Vice UK Executive Editor Xing Tseng, and Daily Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey. Today, the government denies it's introducing local lockdowns by stealth.
I think it's about extra caution. The Prime Minister set out quite clearly to the public about the risks of this variant.
So why do some local authorities say they weren't informed? Also today,
It's a Conservative Party Islamophobia, Mr Rabb.
An independent review says the Conservatives may have given the impression they're insensitive to Muslim communities. Are they? This immigration raid in Glasgow caused outrage in Scotland, but Home Secretary Priti Patel says she'd do it again. And is the public losing confidence in the BBC?
The once great BBC is rotten.
We've got thousands of journalists out there now doing outstanding work. We never want this to happen again.
Let's start with the story about the BBC. A recent inquiry by Lord Dyson found that the corporation covered up deceitful behaviour by the journalist Martin Bashir to secure an interview with Princess Diana in 1995. The Director General, who you heard there, Tim Davie, in the headline, said there was no doubt that rehiring Bashir years after the interview had been a big mistake. But my question to all of you to start the show is, do you still have confidence in the BBC, Jake?
I do have confidence in the BBC. This is a terrible episode in its history, but I think we should all be hugely proud of the role, particularly in the most recent COVID pandemic, the BBC has played informing society and working with the government to make sure we're all kept safe. This is a terrible thing, and the BBC must deal with the issues that have been raised, accept the recommendations, but in truth, it is a good organisation and one we should all cherish in this country.
Ian?
We'd be much poorer if we didn't have public service broadcasting. It's right that the BBC accepts responsibility of what went wrong. Lady Diana was treated in a shameful way, and those that were responsible for that have to be held to account. But the BBC must remain as a licence fee-driven organisation, delivering first-class public service broadcasting. It has a great future ahead of it. We need to make sure that it adapts for the new age.
Right.
We would be much poorer if the BBC was not here.
Camilla, do you still have confidence? Your readers have confidence in the BBC?
I think so, but I think they're concerned about the lack of accountability shown at the time that initial fears were raised about the Panorama interview. And in fact, those who were complicit, such as Tony Hall, didn't get reprimanded. In fact, they got promoted to Director General. And I think equally the readers are concerned about a lack of diversity of opinion on the BBC, which, to be fair, this programme, this great programme, Politics Live, breaks the mould in that regard, because you do get lots of different voices on, and that's commendable. Although I do remember quite recently writing a story about some episodes of the show being under threat by BBC bosses. So I think they've got to be very, very careful that they are representative of everyone in the UK and not just a protected elite.
Xing, what's your view? Confidence in the BBC?
I'm absolutely confident in the BBC, and I think that if you speak to anyone who's grown up overseas with the BBC World Service, they have confidence in the BBC as well. And don't just forget, the BBC doesn't just operate for the public, even though it's funded by the British public. It also has enormous international and global significance. And I think that mustn't be forgotten in all this.
Let's leave it there. An investigation into discrimination in the Conservative Party was published just a couple of hours ago this morning. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has been reading it and following it. Alex, what are the main findings?
Just a very brief bit of background, Jo. So this was an independent inquiry commissioned in December 2019 after a whole host of allegations about Islamophobic incidents and attitudes in the party, and also about how the party had responded to those. Now, this inquiry looked at the way the party dealt with those kind of allegations, and there are some really important findings. Broadly, what it says is since 2015, the bulk of complaints the party's received about discrimination are to do with anti-Muslim prejudice. It says it's not a systemic problem in the party, but it does exist and it is a problem, largely at local association level. And the bulk of these incidents do take place on social media, but there's some real criticism about the party's processes and some shortcomings flagged in the way it's dealt with all of this. It talks about the complaint system being under-resourced, with staff inadequately trained, with documents going missing, with correspondence not being passed on. It also mentions that the party's been very reactive to this issue. It's been driven by the media, with the party not getting on the front foot with regard to it. And while it notes that party leaders talk about a zero-tolerance approach to discrimination, it says that discriminatory behaviour still occurs, and that is really damaging for the Conservative Party.
What does the report say specifically about the Prime Minister, Alex?
Well, while it notes that a lot of this is happening at local association level, it does mention high-profile comments, and it does single out, among others, Boris Johnson, those comments that he made, if you remember, back in 2018 about Muslim women wearing the burqa, comparing them to letterboxes. Now, this says that those kind of high-profile comments suggest that the party and the leadership is insensitive to Muslim communities. Now, the inquiry team did ask Boris Johnson about this. They gave him the opportunity to apologise, and he told the inquiry team that he was sorry for any offence caused. He wouldn't make those comments now as Prime Minister, but he did say that in journalism, you need to be able to use language freely. So that same defence of the comments that he made at the same time. Now, it's just worth noting, Jo, that the party said that it's going to look at these recommendations and respond later on this afternoon. We've had some initial reaction from Baroness Sayeeda Vazi, of course, the former Conservative Party chair. She says the detail in this report tells a story the headlines don't. Each section reveals deep and embedded racism. And Sajid Javid, of course, the former Home Secretary, who was one of those instrumental in getting this inquiry commissioned, he says while it didn't find systemic anti-Muslim prejudice, there were some distressing examples and there are serious shortcomings in the complaint system. He strongly urges the party to accept the report's recommendations in full.
Alex, thank you very much. Well, let's just pick up, Jake, particularly on the reaction there from senior Conservatives, former Cabinet Minister Sayeeda Vazi, former party chairman, in fact, and former Chancellor Sajid Javid. Does the Conservative Party have a problem with Islamophobia?
Well, I think the report's clear that there is no systemic problem with Islamophobia. But let's be clear. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Singh for undertaking this report. It's a very good piece of work. It's highly complex. There are many recommendations which the party is going to respond to formally. But for any Conservative, including Conservative members of Parliament or just people who are members of our party, they should be deeply concerned about some of the issues that have been highlighted in this report. And from my point of view, I represent a very diverse seat. We have a large Bangladeshi heritage community, many of whom are members of the Conservative Party. There is no room for this type of prejudice in the Conservative Party. There's no room for it in my local association, and it should be, it should be dealt with most severely.
Right, but I mean, let's look at what Sayeeda Vazi actually says. She says each section reveals a deep and embedded issue of a party at best unable and at worst unwilling to deal with the issue of racism. So I put it to you again, is the party Islamophobic?
I don't believe the party is Islamophobic. I've answered that question. What I'm saying, the report very clearly criticises the complaints procedure at Central Office. I think an appropriate reaction would be from the Conservative Party to ensure that that complaints procedure is made robust, and that zero-tolerance approach that we've heard about from leading politicians, from the Prime Minister down, is embedded across the Conservative Party. This is not welcome. If you want to be Islamophobic, don't join my party. Go somewhere else.
Let's just have a look at some of the detail. As you say, we've got to read through all parts of it, but it says that between 2015 and 2020, the party recorded 1,418 complaints regarding 727 incidents of alleged discrimination, and that 2/3 of all incidents related to allegations of anti-Muslim discrimination. On the basis, the report concludes anti-Muslim sentiment remains a problem within the party. Do you accept that?
Clearly, from those numbers, it is a problem within the party. But I think more generally, it's a problem within society. I actually think that we have Islamophobia embedded across our society, and the Conservative Party, as a membership organisation with hundreds of thousands of members, to some extent represents society, which is why we need real clear leadership from the Prime Minister, from everyone in politics.
Do you think there hasn't been real clear leadership on this, and that that's why there's still a problem?
No, I think the Prime Minister has given leadership on this. We probably have one of the most diverse cabinets that this country has ever known. I think that's a really good thing for our country. I think it's great for society. But the message needs to go out there from all politicians, whichever party you're in, this is not an acceptable thing in society and we want to stamp it out.
Right, it may not be acceptable, and I often hear politicians saying that to some extent there are problems within society, and to some extent parties reflect that. But are you shocked that 2/3 of these hundreds of incidents are about allegations of anti-Muslim discrimination?
Yeah, I am shocked. I think it makes very difficult reading for the Conservative Party, and I think that's why I expect the party centrally and the party chairman to react to this in a positive way and hope and accept the recommendations of the report.
Camilla, how damning is this report?
I think it's pretty damning. I mean, I see that Jake's pointed out that they haven't found sort of institutionalised Islamophobia in the Tory party. Having said that, I suppose the difficulty, lots of phobias of anything or anti-Semitism are bred out of ignorance. And sometimes we get these reports and it leads to a situation where people feel they can't even discuss the issues without being branded phobic, which is problematic. If you look at the criticism of Johnson's references to letterboxes and what have you, crass and cruel and indeed disrespectful as they were, that has led to him being branded a racist when actually the column was intended to argue that people who wanted to wear the burqa should be free to do so. So if we get a report, like any report in politics, which then leads to people running scared of debating the issues, that in turn builds up resentment and I think creates a culture of sort of racial prejudice. So it's difficult.
Right. Language is important, Ian, but you heard there from my colleague Alex Forsyth talking about the report's author language. You should be able to express yourself freely in that sense. What do you say in response to the specific complaints about Boris Johnson?
I mean, it's dreadful. I mean, at the end of the day, look, there is a problem in society, and that's reflected, as Jake has said, as you said in the report. And we need to make sure that we remove this as a scourge from our society. But the Prime Minister is in a position of leadership, and his comments that he made way back in 20...
The context that Camilla has set out.
No, because you cannot use language the way that he has done to talk about the burqa, to talk about letterbox smiles. These things were deeply offensive. And the Prime Minister should have, through this inquiry, unreservedly apologised and said that these remarks simply are not acceptable from a position of leadership that he is in.
But you accept that the report also says that the party is not institutionally racist.
At the end of the day, there's 1,400 different complaints that have been made by 700-odd different people. There is a problem that has to be tackled. Look, all of us have got to raise our game on this collectively, and I accept what Jake has said. There's got to be zero tolerance, but that starts from the top, and the Prime Minister's got to go further. I've tackled this at Prime Minister's questions, and the fact that the Prime Minister has not apologised, he's been given the opportunity once again, he should do so, and we need to make sure that whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Jew, whether you're anyone else in society, that you can live in peace and freedom in this country without a threat of anti-Semitism, a threat of attacks on Muslims. It's not acceptable.
Right. I mean, I'll come to you, back to you, Jake, in just a moment. But Zing, you heard there Baroness Varsi, who obviously thinks there is still a very deep problem with racism within the party. But the report says that the allegation of institutional racism isn't borne out by the evidence. How do you view that difference?
I mean, Baroness Varsi has been banging this drum for years now, and she is the one who has been having a debate about whether or not Islamophobia exists in the Conservative Party. And from the way that she's been treated and her concerns about the party have been treated, to me, are more than enough evidence of the fact that there is some degree of institutional Islamophobia within the Tory party. I mean, if you just look at the number of allegations that have come out over the last few years and the type of things that were said about Muslim people, especially Muslim women. You know, you had Tory activists branding Islam a cult. You had Tory activists calling Muslim women bin bags. I mean, this stuff goes really, really deep. And I think that the real question that's hardest for the Tories to answer is, what is it about the party's character that is attracting people like this to the party? And what is it about the party's operating that makes them feel emboldened to make these kind of comments on social media, not expecting to get called out for it? And I think these are much deeper questions that, you know, the real question is whether or not the party would like to answer them in any substantive detail.
Right. I mean, Jake, Boris Johnson was interviewed as part of this report and he said he wanted to apologise. I think I've got the precise words, or say sorry for any offence that may have been caused by comments he made during his journalistic career. Isn't that a bit of a non-apology?
Well, I'm not sure I accept that. I think the Prime Minister, you know, has been clear that he not only did he apologise for the offence, he said that now in the position of leadership of Prime Minister, he would not make those comments again. I think that's a sensible response from the Prime Minister. But I go back to the point that it is for the government and the Conservative Party to respond to this report. We are a Conservative government, so there must be a response to it. And I hope that that response says we are going to root this out, we are going to clamp down on it, we will have a zero tolerance approach in a way, actually, that you didn't see by the Labour Party with anti-Semitism until Keir Starmer became the leader and then really gripped this issue. And
right, but looking at what other parties do, as you say, when you are focused on Islamophobia and allegations of it within the Conservative Party, what does that zero tolerance look like?
Well, it should be that if people are found to have made an Islamophobic comment online or anywhere else, they should no longer be a Conservative.
Ian, it is about transparency. Is the SNP fully transparent when it comes to complaints of discrimination?
Absolutely, and of course there's legislation which has been passed in the Scottish Parliament and the last government put through on the Hate Crime Act. So it's really important that there is freedom for people to express themselves, but we cannot have a situation where there is intolerance and people are feeling threatened.
And have you got figures then, obviously in the interest of transparency? You say that is the case with the SNP. How many complaints of discrimination do you receive?
Well, look, if you're talking about the party, that's a matter for the party. I have no role within that. But if any complaints are raised within the SNP, then these will be dealt with, wherever they come from. Right.
I mean, Camilla, this issue of transparency, I mean, how much of it is down to the fact that we don't know exactly the numbers clearly for parties when it comes to issues of discrimination?
I think that's problematic. I mean, equally, it leads to generalisations, doesn't it? That, you know, the Tory party is per se Islamophobic, the Labour Party is per se anti-Semitic, when we do want statistics. I mean, Ian speaking there, one wonders whether there have ever been any complaints against the SNP for Anglophobia.
Right. Ian?
There's no place for Anglophobia or anything else, and myself and the First Minister have made that point repeatedly. I mean, I've used the phrase before that it's not a question of where you're from, it's where you're going. People's ethnic background, whether they're Scots, English, Irish, Welsh or anything else, is irrelevant. It's the contribution that people make to society, and everyone must have that freedom to express their view from a position of safety. And let me make it clear that any anti-English rhetoric from anyone in Scotland will not be tolerated.
All right, we're going to talk about COVID rules and some confusion over a change in the guidance on restrictions for 8 local authority areas in England. You can see them now here on the government website. They are Bedford, Blackburn and Darwin, Bolton, Burnley, Kirklees, Leicester, the London Borough of Hounslow and North Tyneside. You can see quite a big geographical spread. These are all areas where the COVID variant first identified in India is spreading fastest. Now, the change to the guidance, which is not law, appears to have been made on Friday without an official announcement, prompting criticism, understandably, from MPs and local health professionals and officials who seemingly weren't told and didn't know. Jake, your constituency, I presume, takes in one of these local authorities.
Proud Member of Parliament for
absolutely. Does this... did you know, first of all, about the change in the guidance?
No, I found out from the media late last night, so I wasn't given any full warning of it, nor was the local authority.
Right, so what's going on? I mean, that is extraordinary.
Well, it may be. I just believe in that. That is the situation. However, what I would say is I have been in contact with the Health Secretary on numerous occasions since it became clear that the Indian variant is taking hold in parts of Blackburn with Darwin. He has been very responsive. He is surging in additional COVID vaccination. But in terms of the change of rules, I found out from the media.
Right. So what's going on? I mean, why isn't the government telling at least their local MPs and health professionals about important changes in guidance?
Well, you'd have to ask the government that.
Have you phoned up?
No, I haven't had any communication, as I found out from the media, as did the Chief Executive of my local council.
And would you have expected to?
I was surprised to find out from the media rather than from a colleague in government.
Right. Well, you weren't the only one who was surprised. Let's just show you this tweet. The Director of Public Health in Blackburn didn't know about the change. He tweeted this at 7 o'clock this morning, Dominic Harrison. Local government areas involved were not consulted with, warned of, notified about or alerted to this guidance. I've asked to see the National Risk Assessment, which supports this action. It has not been provided to us yet. How long should they be waiting?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a question for the government. What I would say is what we want to see in these areas, one of which I represent, is I think now is the time for the government to surge in vaccinations for everyone over the age of 18. They're currently surging in second vaccinations. I don't think that's good enough. And in addition to that, I want to hear from the government about financial support for the businesses that will be severely financially affected by this. I think that the government does need to respond to members of parliament and local authority leaders and heads of health bodies to start talking to us. At the moment, they're not.
Right. I mean, there is a sort of real-life consequence as well. I mean, you say you were surprised you weren't informed because North Tyneside Director of Public Health was welcoming people to the area where the changed guidance is now saying don't travel there. I mean, can you reassure people local lockdowns aren't being introduced by stealth and this is why the government didn't publicise it?
Well, I think we'd have to have a very good look at whether this in truth is a bit of a local lockdown. I sort of subscribe to the view if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, more often than not, it is a duck. It looks like a local lockdown to me, and I'm very disappointed in that. And I think that if that is the government's new approach, then they need to come out and explain it both to members of parliament and local councils and affected communities, who are the most important part of this. And in truth, most people don't follow the government website in great detail.
No.
And if you're changing the guidance, and it is only guidance that affects people, there needs to be proper communication so members of parliament can communicate it with our constituents.
Absolutely. Camilla?
Well, I'm just shaking my head because I can't believe the monumental communications cock-up that this has been. I mean, not to tell local health leaders and MPs and others is one thing, but to not actually properly inform the public in those areas. Who on earth goes on government websites of an evening, just to check?
Some of us do.
It's a bit of a
I know we do, Jo, but I mean, just to check whether maybe my area may have been subject to travel restrictions, it's ludicrous. And equally, it comes at a time where I think compliance is waning because of the success of the vaccination rollout and the fact that people are really looking forward to getting back to their lives come June the 21st. So it's almost even more damaging in that respect because you'd arguably need more communication, not less.
Right. I mean, Ian, the Scottish Government has imposed localised restrictions. Glasgow is currently, I think, the only area in level 3, meaning it's not possible to visit other people in their homes. So you clearly think, and the Scottish Government clearly thinks, different rules for different areas is an approach that works.
Yes, indeed. And of course, what happened with Glasgow and what happened previously with Murray is that communication took place. Local authorities were engaged with, politicians were engaged with. Of course, the First Minister, as she's doing today, is giving a COVID update because that's the responsibility of leadership. That's the responsibility that the Prime Minister has to Jake and to his constituents and everyone else. And the fact that we're in this situation, people don't know what to do if they're not being communicated with properly. It is a shambles. And I hate to say it, it's the government in London repeating many of the mistakes they've made over the last year of not being able to communicate effectively. This is pretty basic. And if I was Jake, I mean, I think he's been quite calm and measured. I'd be absolutely furious.
Jake?
That that he doesn't know what's going on in his own local area, his own local authority doesn't know what's going on. This is not acceptable. This is a failure of government.
Are you furious and just keeping it inside, Jake?
I'm always calm and measured. I don't know. Ian is accusing me of losing my rank. What I'd say is this. We've been told by the government that the release of lockdown won't revert in England back to a tiered or regional approach. We've been told that the release will hopefully be irreversible. This doesn't seem to align with that approach. So I'm not furious. I'm just intrigued about when we're going to hear more detail on what's going on in the town of Darwin, in Bolton and in other areas.
Right. And when you were last on the programme, Jake, I seem to remember that you criticised Keir Starmer for promoting or calling for a national lockdown, but you thought local lockdowns were OK. Isn't this just what the government's doing?
Well, if it is what the government's doing, they should tell us, I think, is the point I'm making. And what I'd also say is, local lockdowns, in my opinion, have been shown not to work. Now, I'm not an expert. I don't see the data. I'm not a scientist.
So you've sort of changed your mind?
If they do work, we've had local lockdowns for almost a year in Blackburn with Darwin and Bolton, 2 adjoining boroughs where I live, in the area. And if they do work, why are our rates still so high and why have they been so stubbornly high? So it's not an approach I would advocate. But if the science says it's the way that the government should go, then the government needs to come out and tell us why and tell us.
Well, you do believe in them, don't you?
Absolutely. But I think the point about communication and people following the guidance and the regulations is important.
Sure.
And if you've got a situation that people don't know what's going on, then of course you're not going to have the following of it. I mean, we've had to do this in Murray. The rates have come down. It's gone into level 3. We hope that the measures that have been taken in Glasgow will work, and we'll see Glasgow move into level 3 when it's appropriate to do so. But the reason that this has been done is to protect people locally, is to stop the spread of the virus, and it really is important that people do follow the guidance in order that we get people back to life as normal as soon as we can.
All right, Zing?
I mean, I think it's just a shambles, as people have said. I think in the years to come, there are going to be academics and researchers examining the way the government has communicated with the public during this pandemic, and will judge it to have come up really, really short, because you can't berate people for not following the rules when you don't make them aware of any rule changes to begin with. And I do think that, Jake has been unusually calm. If I was in his position, I would also be highly irritated and also very intrigued as to when official guidance would actually reach my inbox. Finding things out through the media, that's not the way any party should be treating its MPs or politicians, especially when there's so many lives and livelihoods at stake for this.
What about, Zing, people in those areas that have been under lockdowns for far longer than other parts of England? Difficult for them to be facing any more local restrictions?
Exactly. And I think that, what Camilla said about compliance waning is absolutely correct. People have gone through a lot over the last year and a half. And I think that the least the government owes them is some degree of transparency and openness about whether or not that situation is going to change. And if that situation is going to change and it's going to, leave them stuck in lockdown again, the least they can do is offer them more financial help to weather that storm.
All right. Well, as a public sector broadcaster, you can see that changing guidance on the government website. It might be worth a look. Let's talk to the BBC's deputy political editor, Vicky Young, who has some breaking news for us today. Vicky.
Yeah, that's right. The Conservative MP for Delyn, Rob Roberts, has been found to have broken the parliamentary sexual misconduct policy. Now, the independent panel that looked into all of this concluded that the case constituted a serious and persistent breach of that policy. They said that the MP's conduct could reasonably be viewed as a series of sexual advances. They also said that Mr Roberts was in a very powerful position as an employer in relation to the complainant. Now, they are recommending that he is suspended from the House of Commons for 6 weeks. Now, that will have to be voted on by MPs. And interestingly, in this case, it does not automatically trigger a so-called recall petition. Now, you remember that normally, if a standards committee decides that MP is suspended for more than 10 days, a recall petition is triggered and constituents can then hold a by-election. That doesn't apply in this case. Labour say that is completely absurd, and they say that he should resign. And important to say also in this report, the impact on the complainant in all of this. The panel says there can be no doubt about the impact of the conduct in this case. It was severe. His life has been permanently altered and he has lost the professional future to which he was fully committed.
Vicky, you've been looking at wider issues about the way Parliament handles complaints. What have you discovered?
Yeah, you'll remember that when the Me Too scandal really swept the globe, it happened here in Westminster too. Now, an independent grievance process was set up. Now, most people do say that that is a huge improvement on what was there before. But we've been speaking to some of the people who have been through that process, and a couple of things do come through. A lot of them very upset about the amount of time these cases can take. Sometimes it's years. There's also the whole aspect of power, really, which we heard there in the report there into Rob Roberts too, this power dynamic that you have. Now, important to say, this grievance system isn't just for MPs, of course, it's for all of the staff, and people I've spoken to say that you do have this hierarchical process in Parliament. It can be in all sorts of parts of Parliament. There are thousands of people who work here, but of course it's MPs that grab the headlines in all of this. Now, there is a helpline, there's an independent panel to look at sanctions, but as I say, a lot of them are very concerned about how long this whole thing is taking, including Andrea Leadsom. She's the woman who was leader of the Commons and helped set up the whole process.
So I was delighted with where we landed it in July 2018. The problem is, I don't think that it has been implemented strictly to the letter of what we set out to do. And that, that's not anyone's malicious intent. But very specifically, I think the old justice delayed is justice denied. That is its fundamentally biggest problem, is it just takes so long to get to a finding.
And that, of course, is very difficult for both sides in these cases. With the length of time that it goes on for, it's very distressing for everybody involved. And there are other senior MPs and members of the House of Commons who do think that this needs to change. So the system is constantly evolving. No doubt most people think it is better than what was there before, but there still seems to be quite a lot of work that needs to be done.
Vicky Young, thank you. And you can find out more about Vicky's story and her investigation into that complaints procedure at Parliament on the BBC News website. Now, you may remember this story from last week. We covered it on Politics Live. It was a protest in Glasgow. You can see pictures here after immigration officers attempted to remove 2 Indian nationals suspected of immigration offences. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, was speaking about this yesterday. Let's have a listen to what she said.
Now, in response to Glasgow and the removal of people that had no legal right to be in the UK, I've already said in my remarks today, we will continue to do that. That is effectively what the British public have voted for, they want, and actually it's part of my legal duty as well and responsibilities in terms of not just immigration enforcement, but removing those with no legal right to be here.
That's Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. Ian, she says these are the immigration policies that people have voted for, and she's carrying out her legal duty. She's right.
Well, certainly not in Scotland, because we take a different approach to these things. And we're talking here
But immigration is part, of course, of the UK government's remit.
Well, it's causing us no end of problems, and I'll maybe come on to that in a second. But here we've got 2 individuals that have been here for a lengthy period of time. They've both been working. They're both making a positive contribution to society. And what you saw in Glasgow was the community saying, we don't give our consent to these 2 individuals being removed. Now, we're facing a real crisis in Scotland. When I had a hotel group in Skye onto me last night, employing 65 people, they want to employ 77. The labour that they would normally have coming from Europe can't come and work. I've got a hotel in the West Highlands that's had to restrict its opening hours because it can't find labour. And it's the immigration policies of Priti Patel that are causing that problem. But fundamentally in all of this, about how we work as a society, how we welcome people. And the fact is that Scotland is an open society. We want people to come and make a contribution to life in Scotland. We've got a Home Secretary that's operating a hostile immigration policy. We all remember the vans that used to go around telling people to go home. That's not the way that we treat people in Scotland.
Jake?
Well, I don't think it is irresponsible of the government to seek to remove people who are here illegally. And in fact, where you have people blocked from who are here illegally, it plays into the hands of the people traffickers who say to people, look, if you come to Britain, you can't be removed, you won't be removed. It funds crime and that miserable trade across Europe. I absolutely support what the Home Secretary set out. And more widely in Scotland, of course, there are 120,000 people currently unemployed in Scotland. You do have control of the education budget and retraining. And if you have all these vacancies, surely the first port of call for the Scottish people should do what you have control of, re-educate people, enable them to get into work and do what the SNP government was elected to do.
That's exactly what we're doing, but we rely on migrant labour. We have done, and of course freedom of movement was a great boon for us in terms of people coming to Scotland and Scots going to work elsewhere. But we simply don't have that labour pool in the Highlands as one example, which is why hotels can't fully open.
Right.
It's an absolute tragedy that we're facing, and the hostility of the UK government to recognise that we have different needs. And the fact is, the 2 individuals that we're talking about are valued members of society. They're not a threat to anyone, and we wish to see them continue their life.
How do you know they're not a threat to anyone?
No, because we know the individuals that are concerned. We know that the role that they've been playing in the community in the south side of Glasgow. They're valued members of that community. It was demonstrated by those that turned out to support them, and of course the police that then said that they should not be removed
Ian,
at that time.
Can I just remind you and viewers that the SNP's blueprint for an independent Scotland prior to the 2014 referendum acknowledged there would be a need for forcible removals. So you would carry out forcible removals if it was in your remit. It wouldn't be any different to what we saw there.
Every country has to, of course, control its borders. Every country has to have an immigration policy.
So what would be different about yours?
But what we have spoken about on a number of occasions, and certainly my Home Affairs and Justice team have spoken about, is the dawn raids that have been taking place, the way this has been done, the detention centres, Dunvegan, that we have in South Lanarkshire.
OK, so you'd end dawn raids. how would you do it instead? You do them later in the day, or...?
No, look, the whole point is that we have a hostile immigration policy in the UK. And when you've got a situation like this, that people are making a contribution to society, that we would look favourably on those sets of circumstances.
Sure.
That people that
but what people might ask is, what makes them hostile? Why would yours not be hostile if, as you have just said, you would have a need to forcibly remove people who were here illegally?
Well, what we do is we'd have compassion and humanity at the heart of everything that we do, something that's sorely missing from the approach of the Home Office and Priti Patel.
Camilla?
I find this odd. I don't understand what kind of environment Ian wants towards illegality. If it isn't hostile, then it has to be welcoming. What to illegality, to illegal immigration? Equally, I find the whole vilification of Priti Patel strange and frankly hypocritical by her main critics. I mean, this is a woman who is the daughter of immigrants. She's in a role at the Home Office where it is her actual job to make sure that there is an uncontrolled illegal immigration. And yet people like the SNP and others and her critics like to mix this all up and suggest that she's anti any immigration. Well, of course she isn't. But presumably we do have to have a degree of control. I mean, Ian's got himself tied up in knots there, because on one hand he's saying that we do need border control, and yet we should be very welcoming to people who are here illegally. That doesn't make any sense.
The fact is that these are two people that are valued members of our society, but we face a crisis in Scotland. I've talked about what's happening in the hospitality industry. If I look at what happens in the agricultural sector, we're going to be short of people to pick crops, to pick fruit and vegetables. There's a real issue about making sure that we've got the labour that we need in order to grow our economy, and we're stopped in doing that from the restrictive policies that the UK government has. You will be judged by the way that you treat people. We don't have an issue with uncontrolled illegal migration in Scotland. We have an issue of not having access to labour that we need in order to make sure that our economy can do the job that we need it to do.
Camilla?
But isn't Britain one of the most welcoming countries on earth? I mean, I know attempts have been to rewrite our history on this by the left, but we wouldn't be so popular with immigrants if it weren't for the fact that we were welcoming rather than hostile. That's the whole reason we live in a very multicultural society.
Right, Zing, how do you respond to that? Britain is one of the most welcoming countries in the world. Do you agree?
I mean, I feel like whenever people talk about the immigration system in the UK, they come from an experience of having never been through the immigration system themselves. But, you know, immigrants like myself have been through it. And I can tell you that when you are actually in the grip of the Home Office and the immigration system, and I had a very, very minor taste of this as someone who's relatively privileged, is that it is incredibly punitive, it is incredibly surveilled, and it is also incredibly prohibitively expensive. So, for instance, to register a child as a UK citizen costs over £1,000. When you go to other countries in Europe, that cost depreciates and it gets lower and lower. You know, I'm currently in the process of saving up to become a British citizen. That will cost me over £1,300. You know, this is the immigration system that seeks to make money off immigrants who do have a right to be here and do have a right to live here. And I think that there's been a really pernicious conflation of immigrants like that with illegal migration. Because don't forget, the men in Scotland have not been assessed to as having an illegal right to stay here. You know, they're currently in the middle of having legal representation. So it may very well emerge in a few months' time that they are perfectly valid to seek an existence in the UK and they have a right to live here. But we're simply kind of assuming that they don't have a right to live here and that they deserve to be taken away and don raised. And I think it's very clear that a vast majority of the population, at least in Glasgow, feel very, very differently about the way that the immigration system can be run.
Right. Talks about a pernicious way of the charges, for example, of becoming a British citizen. That doesn't sound very welcoming, Jake. Well,
it seems to me right that I don't think the Home Office does make money, per se. They seek to recover costs. But look, in this country, people want a fair immigration system which is welcoming to people from around the world, wherever you come from, come to the UK, contribute to our economy. That is the whole point of a points-based immigration system. But it is reasonable for the government to say where people short-circuit that system in any way, where they come in by illegal routes, where they are here illegally, where there is a suspicion that they don't have the right to remain here, they don't have a legal status. It is reasonable and right for the government to say, in order to support a world-class welcoming immigration system, there has to be some element of enforcement.
Zing?
But that enforcement doesn't just affect people who are here illegally. It would also affect migrants who are here with a legal right to stay. Because if you go to Yarl's Wood, if you go to any detention centre, you'll meet people in the process of having their cases heard who may very well, at the end of that, be told by the courts that they have a right to live here. So you've just put them through this incredibly harsh, brutal and punitive system for nothing, to just simply traumatize them. It just doesn't make any sense to me. That's why you can't conflate illegal migration with the migration routes that people take to legally get here. But for some reason, these dawn raids just seem to affect everyone. So how can you really account for that? That doesn't seem very fair to me.
Jake?
Well, the point I was making is it is reasonable for the government to seek to enforce the immigration system in a way that actually keeps everyone's confidence.
But is it taking in...
seeks to shut down the illegal routes into the UK, which
but do you
is a
accept
miserable
Zing's point
trade
that others are being caught up in that system, people who do have a legal right to be here?
Well, I think the point is being made at the end of a very long and drawn-out system, they may ultimately get the right to remain, and the government would say, well, in the interim, we are administering a robust immigration system that people can have confidence in, and that's something I support.
In several situations. One was a high-profile one, the Brain family that came here in the post-study work visa programme. The UK government changed the rules. The family were deported back to Australia. There was a long-running campaign that we won in the end, but the heartache that family went through was intolerable. I had another family that were from Scotland. The man was from Scotland. The woman had been born in India. Her visa was turned up, and she was told she was being deported. Their children were having to be looked after by her grandparents. It's this lack of compassion that's in the system, this lack of humanity, and the barriers that are put to people actually in many cases have a legal right to be here is something that we find just deeply offensive.
Right. I mean, Ian has a point, doesn't he, Jake, in the sense that people in Scotland didn't vote for this particular form of immigration policy. And if they don't like this kind of treatment, shouldn't they get a say?
Look, we are one United Kingdom government. We had a general election.
Sure, but you could devolve. What about devolving immigration policy? I'm not talking about independence.
Ian's comments seem to indicate that he thinks that actually, immigration rules should apply to everyone equally. But if you're a nice person and you've broken the rules, then there should be no action taken against. That isn't a system that can realistically function. It has to treat everyone, regardless of where they're from, whatever country they have come to the UK from. It has to treat people from Australia equally with people from any other country in the world. You can't have a system that says if you're nice, it doesn't apply to you.
People that come to Scotland at university should have the right to stay and work and live in Scotland and make a contribution to our society. There is nothing stopping the UK government giving the Scottish government control over immigration in Scotland in order that we can deal with our specific needs.
Look, I don't accept that. There is no border between Scotland and England, and I hope I never get to see it in my lifetime. But if you have people who have, it is a UK-based system. You can't have border checks in Scotland to say, well, I'm here under Scottish law and I'll go and work in London. It just wouldn't work.
Canada, where provinces have responsibility over migration, it can be done, but the UK government simply refused to accept that we have specific needs. We have a crisis in our agricultural sector, we have a crisis in our hospitality sector, and the UK government is being tin-eared to, and it means that we're losing economic opportunity because of that lack of desire to recognise that we have needs that are not being addressed.
Camilla?
I would just reflect on the point that Zing made about, immigration being punitively expensive. I don't know whether that's a unique experience to Britain. I think I don't have an experience with immigration per se, but I certainly have a lot of experience through work of having to obtain visas to visit far-flung destinations. And anyone that's ever been to the US Embassy or others, I had to get a Cuban visa once, will have experienced a pretty unfriendly and unwelcoming approach to people coming in. I think that's just the way that immigration is administrated, because, as Jake has pointed out, you've got to be pretty even-handed when it comes to sifting through facts rather than emotions when granting people passage.
Zing?
I mean, I think that just because the Cuban immigration system felt unwelcoming, it doesn't mean that the British immigration system needs to be that way. And I think that, if we're really aiming to be global Britain, as Priti Patel set out in her speech the other day, then we really should be trying to figure out an immigration system that feels truly global and doesn't treat immigrants as if they're second-class citizens and treats them as an unwelcome quantity. Because, as Ian has pointed out, in many places in the UK, they are very much welcome.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Just before we go, let me just show our viewers, and I'll explain to our other guests, this graph, perceived impact of migration. Good for the economy. 46% of people agree in Scotland. England and Wales, 47%. Good for culture. Exactly the same between Scotland, England and Wales. Views on immigration, Scotland thinks the same as elsewhere in Britain, Ian?
Well, certainly what I find that people that come to Scotland from elsewhere around the world get a welcome. Immigrants tell me that. The fundamental issue here is that if we don't get access to that labour, then we are going to be in difficulties in terms of delivering sustainable economic growth. And I've given the real live examples of what we're facing in the West Highlands today, that hotels can't open because they can't attract the labour that they were able to do when we had freedom of movement with the European Union.
That's all we have time for. Thank you to all of my guests for today's programme. I'll be back tomorrow at the earlier time, of course, for PMQs at 11:15. Join me then.